let's talk about veganism. You've seen it online, right? The conversation can feel, well, like a total battlefield. It's so confusing and polarized, and it seems like everyone has a super strong opinion one way or the other.
I mean, one minute you see a headline telling you a plant-based diet is the secret to a long life, and the very next day you'll read another one that claims it's a dangerous nutritional trap. So, what's really going on?
Well, what if the most important part of this whole debate isn't actually the food at all, but the language we use to talk about it? There's a fascinating PhD thesis that suggests our entire perception is shaped not just by facts, but by these carefully constructed narratives. Okay, let's get into this. The field that looks into this is called eco-linguistics, and it's all about how the words we use and the stories we tell literally build the world we live in. It's about these stories we live by, and it's a really powerful way to understand a hot-button topic like veganism. So, here's our game plan. First, we're going to look at the research itself. Then, we'll break down the two big types of stories being told, what the researcher calls the destructive and the beneficial. And finally, we'll get into why all of this matters no matter what you eat. All right, so the source for all of this is a doctoral thesis by Mario Alfonso Leto II. He did this incredible deep dive into how veganism is portrayed across all kinds of media. We're talking news articles, user comments, documentaries, even cookbooks. And get this. Across all those different sources, he identified 67 completely distinct ways that veganism was represented. That's 67 different stories floating around about the exact same thing. But they weren't all given equal airtime. The research sorted these stories into two buckets: destructive, so the negative ones, and beneficial, the positive ones. And here's the kicker. As you can see, the destructive stories were way more common. So let's start there. Let's take a look at these more common destructive stories. What are these negative narratives that just keep popping up over and over again? This was the big one. According to the research, the single most common destructive story was this right here: the idea that a vegan diet is just inherently bad for you, that it's lacking or unbalanced or even flat out dangerous. This was the #1 negative message.
But oh, it did not stop there. The research found a whole bunch of other negative stereotypes. You had vegans being painted as hostile extremists, you had vegan men being portrayed as weak or effeminate, and kind of ironically, veganism itself was sometimes framed as being bad for the planet. Other stories just called vegans ignorant or even mentally unstable.
So how are these stories actually built? Well, the thesis points to a primary linguistic tool called facticity patterns. This is such a cool concept. It's when you take an opinion, like veganism is unhealthy, and you just state it over and over again, as if it's a completely settled, undeniable fact, even though it's a massively debated topic. Okay, so let's flip the coin and look at the other side. What about the beneficial stories? How are the positive messages about veganism being put together? Well, no huge surprise here. The most common beneficial story was the direct opposite of the most common destructive one. The idea that veganism is a healthy choice was the #1 positive narrative that the researcher found. And this right here is the absolute heart of the research. It's so brilliant, because while those destructive stories rely on facticity patterns, just stating opinions as if they're facts, the beneficial stories use a totally different tool: narrative structures. Instead of just making a claim, they tell a story, usually a personal, relatable story of someone's journey. A perfect example of this narrative structure in action, and one that's cited in the research, is the documentary The Game Changers. You've probably heard of it. The movie doesn't just tell you veganism is healthy. It shows you through the stories of these elite athletes. The thesis actually breaks down the film's powerful formula, and it's a classic hero's journey. You start with the athlete in their normal life eating meat. Then, some kind of conflict happens, maybe an injury, or they hit a performance wall. This is what pushes them to try a plant-based diet, and that leads to a new, better equilibrium, where they're stronger and healthier than ever. It's a story, you see, not just a statement, and that's the key. So, okay, why does any of this really matter? Well, the real takeaway here isn't about veganism at all. It's actually about becoming a smarter, more critical consumer of information in, well, every part of your life. The point of this whole analysis isn't to get you to eat more kale or more steak. Not at all. It's to give you the tools to see how people are trying to persuade you. It's about learning to spot the stories they're telling so you can make your own truly informed decisions. So let's just quickly recap the big ideas from all this. First, language is never neutral. It's always busy building our reality. Second, we're surrounded by these competing stories that are built with very specific, very intentional linguistic tools. And most importantly, once you learn to recognize those tools, like telling the difference between a facticity pattern and a narrative structure, you can think more clearly and critically about pretty much anything.
And that brings us to one last thought. This framework doesn't just work for diets. It works for politics, for the economy, for technology, for everything. So the real question to leave you with is this: what other stories we live by are being built all around you every single day?